Hello, everyone. Welcome to Virtual VSC. My name is Kristen Mills, and I am the Visual Arts Program Manager here at Vermont Studio Center. This month, we are recognizing LGBTQ plus Pride. It is celebrated each year in the month of June to honor the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in Manhattan. The purpose of commemorating this month is to recognize the impact that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirited plus individuals have had on history, locally, nationally, and internationally. We did an open call online exhibition for any VSA alum who identifies as queer. The show is up online on our website. If you just go to vermontstudiocenter.org and go up to, it's just under exhibitions, it's listed there. And the top 4 were selected to be highlighted. Miranda and Amanda were selected to be our virtual VSC guests. And so they are here with us tonight. Miranda Bellamy and Amanda Fauteux sorry, I'm not laughing, I'm laughing at myself. Are partners and artistic collaborators who extend the stories of wild plants through site-specific research and experimentation. Working through ideas of reciprocity, animacy, and the personhood of non-humans is central to their practice. By listening to plants and responding through interdisciplinary projects, they queer the constructs that separate human beings from non-human beings and make space for the critical revision of human histories. Miranda holds a BFA from the Dunedin School of Art, and Amanda holds an MFA from Concordia University in Montreal. Since their collaborative practice began in 2019, they have attended artist residencies in New York, Vermont, and the USA, and have exhibited their work in New Zealand, Canada, and the US. In June 2020, they were digital artists in residence with Art Space Aotearoa, New Zealand. They live in Dunedin, New Zealand, and I'm sorry, I'm just learning how to speak their language. Anyway, without further ado, Miranda and Amanda, I'm very excited that you're here. The floor is all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.
Sure, and sorry about fumbling.
It's totally fine. We're all learning, and te reo Māori is one tongue twister after the other, and it's a process, and that's part of the fun. So kia ora koutou katoa, everyone. Thank you for welcoming us. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let's just jump right in.
Yeah, good idea.
Where our presentation starts leaves a lot beforehand, I guess. Like, we collided our individual solo practices in 2019, and that's where we're beginning. So I guess we brought our practices together because we started a relationship and we wanted to spend all our time together. So it was a way of, like, I don't know, like just bringing those autonomous, disparate practices together and seeing what happened. And I think going to a residency in Red Hook, Brooklyn, New York City was the first chance to experiment with what that meant. And what you see here in our first slide is, what we found. What did we find?
Yeah, so, well, when we got to Brooklyn, it was early September. And so, end of summer, extremely lush, and everything was completely overgrown. Like, all of the ditches and every little crack and crevice was just full of amazing wildflowers and so much plant diversity that it really drew our focus. And we thought, there's so much going on here. Let's look at this. Prior to collaborating, our practices already had a lot of the same language and ways of looking at things. And one of the common threads in our practice is the idea of sort of looking at what is around and what can be brought forward and what can be kind of unpacked or expanded on by looking at what is just in front of us or what's just overlooked under our feet.
And I think specifically overlooked is the key word. It's about those elephants in the room, those things that you walk by every day but don't notice. Part of our framework as artists is to illuminate those things that are easily missed. And I think wild plants in Red Hook was a perfect example of that, because I don't know, it was the last thing that we expected to find in coming to the city, and those people in the neighborhood that lived with these wonderful 6-foot tall amaranth plants, and I don't know, just incredible biodiversity. You don't necessarily see that when you're just day to day, but we couldn't help but notice.
Yeah, and so that was a way for us to start working together. And the first thing that we did was just try to learn as much as we could about what was actually there. So lots of time looking, note-taking, researching, and trying to identify plants that were around us, and that helped to spark some ideas for new projects. That's just another sort of way we were figuring things out. And one of the places that we started was with natural dyes and natural pigments. So we were collecting very small samples of some of the wild plants that we were finding in the neighborhood, and then extracting natural dyes from them and trying to use that in a way that we could then connect to broader and conceptual ideas. So this is an example of just paper that we had tinted with goldenrod, I believe. Oh yes, goldenrod, it says on the note there. And here's an image of me in the studio with pokeweed trying to extract the dye from that, which is a berry that we found just everywhere around.
And we were really coming at this process not from like an empirical scientific way of thinking or seeing. It was intuitive, it was artistic, and it was amateur. We're not botanists, we're not scientists, so we were feeling our way through this like new relationship with plant identification, and how we might respond to or illuminate or heighten the presence of these wild plants within the neighborhood.
And so one of the things that we ended up doing with the natural pigments was making flags, and then bringing the flags out into the sites where the plants were collected and flying them. And so here we have goldenrod again in a fenced-in area behind. There's some goldenrod. So this was a way of us drawing attention and sort of amplifying the presence of wild plants.
Yeah, and really just like in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, like staking claim for these plants that have been there a lot longer than the concrete jungle of the city.
Mm-hmm. And this is another iteration of that work. We have a sort of gray flag that's been dyed with staghorn sumac leaves. And then on the other side of this panel is, how would you describe that? It's the color of the pigment that we've digitized.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's essentially in the same way that we made the flags. It's just a distilled version of the color that we were able to produce through that rudimentary natural dye process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like it became like really interesting just listening to these plants and hearing their stories and researching and plant identification to hear what they had to say in terms of like where they had come from, these ancient trade routes that had meant that they've ended up here in Red Hook. And I think that cued the start of what has become a real obsession about listening to plants and like using plants as a conduit of sorts to hear and tell human stories.
Yeah.
Here is another work where we were sort of co-opting halfway erected security fence. And we made them flag poles for this temporary natural dye flag intervention, which really only exists as photographic and video documentation. It was a fleeting gesture of reclamation. And that security fence was being erected nearby the Red Hook ball fields, which was a site of particular interest to us.
Yeah, the site of the Red Hook ball fields had been identified as having lead contamination. And so that had been long identified as being a bit toxic or quite toxic. And so all of the ball fields had been fenced in and were no longer used for human recreational activity. But what ended up happening because of that is that the plants completely took over. So you're looking at a soccer field here, I think. I'm not really into sports. But I think that anyway, it doesn't matter what it's for. And I forget off the top of my head, but what you're looking at is a field that's just been completely grown in with wild plants, and it was just amazing. It's also so full of bees and squirrels and other wildlife. I've embarrassed myself by not knowing what sport that field was for off the top of my head.
Yeah, some kind of sport. I'm not sure either.
It doesn't matter anyway. So this site in particular was very interesting to us, and also was in the early phases of a remediation project. And so there were construction crews on site starting to put up barrier fences around the area so that we would have even more reduced access to this site over the course of our residency. And so this really interested us, and we wanted to take advantage of still having access to this site while we were there. And so we came up with a pretty simple intervention in the site. We used the signage that the city was using in the existing sports fields area already. We used the style of that signage to develop these didactic panels that identified plants that were present, and spoke a little bit about their botanical nature, also their social and cultural histories and significance, different uses, and sort of where they come from and why they might be present. So goldenrod is an example. And then what we did was had them printed on vinyl banners and installed them along the fence of the sports field, just in a intervention gesture. And we left them up there. And so you can see here someone taking a walk, maybe on their lunch break from work, and having a read at the panel. That one's pokeweed. And then beside the panel, there's an example of pokeweed hanging right there on the fence. So that was a way for us to draw a little bit more attention to those plants that are taking over and that are present. And yeah.
And I guess it was like a toying with this idea that the city had closed this area off and deliberately let it grow wild as a way of like disincentivizing people's and trying to give voice to the plants of the neighborhood. What we ended up doing was just hearing the sound of our own voice. It was a really difficult thing to think about, like an honest way to just like help to allow these plants to collaborate with us or communicate to us. So it allowed a more unfiltered and honest and type of collaboration, which I think is the real promise of this way of working. And it is a way of working that we've continued to expand, and you'll see how in some of the more recent projects that we're about to share. But yeah, that the visual potential as well as the sonified potential is really great. So we immediately started to experiment with bookmaking, which is kind of a thread that runs through our practice. These are like concertina fold, accordion fold books, which visualize the biodata that in this case has been recorded from a sumac plant. And the cover of each book is the color is generated through natural dye processes. And then we also made this work called Listening to Our Plant Neighbors. And this was something of a centerpiece for the time that we spent in Red Hook. And So that's probably all we have time for right now for that video, but you can find the full length version, which is about 8 or 9 minutes on our websites. And yeah, like that video just, well, listening to our plant neighbors says it all. You know, we were just trying to like bring the members of the neighborhood and community that aren't normally included into the way that we were representing our experience of being in that neighborhood and our artwork. And then pretty soon after, we came to Vermont Studio Center for a 1-month residency in November, December 2019, which was a really seminal experience for our collaboration, I think. Just a wonderful opportunity to try a whole bunch of different experiments and mediums, and you know, without any external influence. It was just a wonderful free sort of time to play. And we were immediately enamored by the story of the American chestnut tree, which is relevant to the area of northern Vermont, being in the natural range of the species. Another example of perhaps this notion of something being overlooked is the American chestnut tree is a species that was super important in the ecology of the Appalachian forests. It was known as the redwood of the East, and it was a really significant keystone species of the forest for, well, millennia, a long time, up until a blight was accidentally introduced around 1900, and it just decimated the species. American chestnut trees were about 1 out of every 4 trees in the eastern forests, and now the species is functionally extinct. So the blight just completely wiped it out, almost completely wiped it out. The trees still do exist, but they are not able to mature successfully. So they grow to a really short height, and then the blight comes, and yeah, they just don't really have a chance. But there are still a very small number of these mature trees about, including one within range of the Vermont Studio Center. So we went to meet this tree as a way of sort of like unpacking and continuing to understand the story of the legacy of the American chestnut tree, which, you know, you can easily imagine was so important for people and animals. It was just such a bountiful food-bearing tree. It would every fall drop a huge amount of mature nuts into the forest floor, which was significant for, you know, a number of species, but also people. They were gathered, used as food, used as a currency to trade for goods, shipped into the cities. Warm chestnuts were known as the first fast food. There's all sorts of incredible tales attached to the species. And so we went to meet this mature American chestnut tree near the Vermont Studio Center. And yeah, just like at that point, was clear that our whole focus of our residency was going to be around the story of this tree.
And we really looked at it from a few angles. One was historical. So we had on eBay sourced some original old growth American chestnut timber that had been reclaimed from an old barn or some older structure. That was one avenue that we took for thinking about this tree. The timber that you get from American chestnut, from old historical American chestnut trees, was known as wormy chestnut, because the trees really did die standing. The blight happened so quickly that the mature trees that were in the forest just died at such a quick rate that there was a lot of insect activity by the time they were able to be processed into timber. So we were really interested in the qualities of this wood and the story that it tells, and made some ceramic impressions of the timber that we were able to source. And you can see that's probably a nail hole, but there's other parts that, well, maybe it isn't. I mean, it's hard to say what that mark is from, but
suffice to say, the wood itself is so rich with narrative, I think, and wasn't a really interesting material to work with, but we also responded through print media, bookmaking, large scale paste ups with tiled prints.
Mhm.
Here is a sculpture called Box with the Sound of Its Own Destruction after Robert Morris. And it's made of that wood that Amanda described. Yeah, just a beautiful material in its own right. We didn't want to do too much with it because it's just so loaded and so filled with stories to tell.
Mhm.
And we made a chestnut, or an approximation of a chestnut burr out of ceramic.
In
These,
much larger scale.
yeah, so this is like the size of a basketball roughly, but the burrs themselves are just so wonderfully sculptural. We wanted to sort of mimic that in the way that we made that piece.
But another line of thinking that we took with this tree was looking forward into the future and the work that is going into developing a transgenic blight-resistant iteration of the American chestnut tree. This is something that is in development, a tree that could resist the blight and be reintroduced into the forests to repopulate itself.
Which is an unprecedented approach for rewilding, reforestation. There's never been a genetically modified organism which has been deliberately put into an environment where it will self-proliferate and rewild a forest. Mm-hmm. Normally GMO crops obviously are designed to be contained and into food production, agricultural contexts. So we were really fascinated about this cusp that we're on, where we might decide or might not that it's appropriate or inappropriate to intervene into a wild ecosystem, such as the forests of northern Vermont. And we wanted to make a gesture or a sculpture that paid attention to that moment in time, I suppose. And so we worked with the Vermont Studio Centre staff to locate an area on campus that we could permanently install a tree plaque, only without a tree, because while these blight-resistant transgenic American chestnut trees are in development, you can't yet buy them. So it's a placeholder of sorts. And we installed it on campus and I'm just going to skip forward slightly. We had an opening ceremony, which would normally be a tree planting ceremony, but as I say, you can't buy this tree yet. So this plaque holds place for that tree while it's unavailable. And if it does become available, pending regulatory approval by the FDA and a number of other US government bodies, then we will plant a blight-resistant American chestnut tree near this plaque, and it will become a more conventional tree plaque at that point. But until then, it's just making space for us to think about the relationship that we have to these wild ecosystems and the agency that we have over them. And I looked up recently in preparation for this talk the status of that regulatory approval, and there have been 3 permits granted for test stands of these transgenic trees. There's one in New England and in Maine. So it is sort of inching towards approval, but no one really knows if it'll actually go ahead or not. And we're not necessarily like saying that it should or shouldn't. Our role as artists is just to shine a light on that space that is otherwise like something that just goes on behind closed doors.
Yeah, and also maybe just to say, like, to think about all the ways that it is complicated. And so when we did our plaque unveiling, we did talk about the history of the tree, how complicated it is to introduce a genetically modified crop, how it could be a slippery slope, or in a sense, for other projects that could be harmful. And just all of the human stories that go along with the chestnut tree and how they're complicated as well. So that was a really important moment in our collaboration. It's just thinking about all of these different branches, if you will, that can be brought together when looking at plants. It's an ecological story, a human story, and yeah.
And like trying to, it was a lesson in just like taking time to choose the right subject. And the American chestnut tree, it was a fascinating subject, and how like complex and historically loaded a tree can be, you know. It's like so tied up with sense of nationalism and xenophobia, and well, there's just so much in there that it only requires a light touch to start to extrapolate some of those stories.
And so shortly after leaving Vermont Studio Centre, we relocated to Aotearoa, New Zealand. We arrived in January 2020, quickly realizing that the world was about to change quite dramatically. Pandemic started, and we were in a lockdown here, as people were all over the world, by March really of 2020. And
that lockdown was really a hard lockdown in Aotearoa in New Zealand. So you were really like confined to your immediate neighborhood, which was really beneficial in terms of like getting to know the plants of our neighborhood. That this is a neighborhood that I've lived in a lot in my life, and certainly I'm also guilty of taking for granted the amazing biodiversity and mature trees. So we sort of designed a project that was to do with getting to know some of those trees better.
And maybe just to say too, before we watch a clip, that this project was part of a digital artist in residence project with Artspace Aotearoa. Just like every art space globally, they were really looking for ways for their work to continue online and using digital platforms. And so they had artists in residence hosted on their Instagram feed for 2 weeks. And so we designed this project to fit into their Instagram feed, and maybe we can share a little bit with you.
So originally designed for a mobile platform, social media context, but we're just going to play a short excerpt now. These are only 30-second videos. So yeah, made in the same vein as listening to our plant neighbors, in that it's the soundtrack that you're hearing is a collaboration between the plant and us, whereby the plant is writing the notes for the score, and we're interpreting that into what you hear.
Yeah, and so what we did was we visited 12 trees around our immediate neighborhood. We made 12 video portraits, one to share each day of our digital residency. And along with the video, we also wrote a caption that would be paired with each video. And the caption identified the plant, where it's from, what it does, but also why it's there. And that helped us to connect with social and cultural histories, unpack a little bit, learn or look in a new way at the histories that we already know, and think critically, I guess, about our surroundings.
And perhaps it was a way of like enrichening and deepening this way of working that we had sort of established, whereby we were making these biodata video portraits. We were continuing to try to like layer on that and make those pieces richer and like, I don't know, expand that way of working, I guess, so that we weren't just repeating ourselves. So sort of following on from that project, we made sheet music that was generated from the biodata of the tree. So the tree itself was determining the position of each of those notes on like a human, traditional music scale. So there's like obviously translation of sorts that happen. It's not pure biodata. It's going through a process of mediation, which we're very aware of, and aware of like the anthropocentric, nature of that process. This is a work that we made for the Auckland Art Fair earlier this year. And again, it's kind of placing biodata nodes on a timeline, but the way that the pigment is developed in this case is using a natural dye process, but then the notes, well, these sort of amorphic notes that you see are drawn out of that natural dye using
ferrous sulfate or iron. So in this case, we used an extracted pure source of iron called ferrous sulfate, but
it could also be rusty nails.
Yeah.
And so we're just like, it's a material experiment effectively, and while it looks like a screen print or something of that nature, it's natural dyes. There's no ink involved in that work on paper. And then we this year we embarked on two really large scale projects. One was for exhibition in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, New Zealand. The other was for exhibition in Otipoti, Dunedin, where we live. So we've spent some time between both of those locations this year developing both of those projects. And we certainly don't take for granted the privilege of being able to do that and being able to travel freely between those places. It's a gift, and we're conscious of the fact that not everyone right now is able to work in that way. So we try not to take that for granted in the development of these projects.
The first of the projects that we developed for our exhibition that was in Auckland looked at a specific site called Kawo Island. What you're looking at here is 4 views of walking trail paths that are present on the island, but I'll just show you a little map of where that is. And so on the one side, you can see where Auckland is. And then if you look up, you see Kawo Island. It's part of the greater city boundaries. So it's not far from a major urban center. But it does feel that way when you get there. You can obviously only get there by boat. There's very few inhabitants, very few permanent residents of the island. And just on the other side, you can see where that is in relationship to Aotearoa broadly and where we live, which is in Dunedin in the lower part of the South Island.
And Kawa Island is a place that's really steeped in fascinating pre-colonial and post-colonial history, especially in terms of its botanical history. It's in that part of New Zealand is subtropical, so think warm, lush native forests with ferns and tall native trees and white sand beaches, but it's had a lot of really like heavy intervention. So this island was owned for quite some time by an early governor of New Zealand, Sir George Grey. So this is a man that came out from England to really like make a mark on New Zealand and establish it as a colony of England. And so he spent a couple of decades living out on this island, and
1862 to 1888. So
that's right.
An early colonial history in the context of New Zealand.
And Sir George Grey was, among many things, just to give it some context, he's a very controversial figure in New Zealand history. You love him or you hate him, I think. And he's sort of painted in a sort of heroic, salubrious sensibility in the history books. But the truth is a lot more complicated, and he caused a lot of harm to Indigenous New Zealand and really waged war against the Māori and was responsible for a lot of harm as well as arguably a lot of good in establishing the colony. So he was, among other things, a really keen botanist and had connections with Kew Gardens, Sydney Botanical Gardens, important gardens all around the world. And he would have species sent out to Kawa Island from all around the world in Wardian cases, which is a very an early way of safely transporting plants around the world over the high seas. And he cultivated Kawa Island as he pleased, really, and he used that as a staging ground for species that would potentially have commercial viability for New Zealand in terms of forestry or food production or agriculture. And so what you find on Kawa now is a really bizarre and unique mix of exotic and natural species that you won't find anywhere else in New Zealand. In this image, you're seeing some panga palms set against tall, old-growth Pinus Radiata, which doesn't, it's an exotic species here in New Zealand, and it was a species that he helped to introduce to the country. It's now all across New Zealand, and he was proving its commercial worth by introducing it to Kawa. So we spent 8 nights out on the island studying the botany of the island and really getting to know the plants that George Gray introduced, but also those native plants that have remained. And alongside these exotic plant species, Sir George Gray also introduced a menagerie of exotic animals. So you won't find them here now, but at one point there were, what else? Zebra.
Water buffalo.
Yeah, I mean, you name it, really. Just the most surprising collection of exotic animals. He brought them all to that island with a similar motivation to the plants, perhaps, just to see how they would behave and survive or not in this new context. So it has a sort of fantastical nature, this island, and we were interested in tapping into that in our work.
We approached the work in similar ways to past audio video works, where we collected biodata from the plants, and we also recorded video portraits. And so our aim was really to continue to expand on that way of working with plants.
But in combination with those video portraits, we wanted to sort of bring the colonial architecture of Kawa Island. There are some buildings that remain, including Mansion House, which is George Gray's old home. And so it's very how to put it, grand, and it really holds a very colonial place on the island, and it's very ornate. And so some of the architectural features of those built environments of the island also feature in this work.
Mm-hmm.
And these are some of the installation views of the resulting exhibition that you're seeing now. So the videos were all shot in portrait orientation and therefore installed in portrait orientation on monitors, and they're synced with each other. So as you'll see in just a moment, we will play a short excerpt. The 4 individual channels are very much in direct relationship with each other. You hear the plants in chorus and cacophony, and you see the relationship that those elements of colonial architecture have to the natural environment.
And just to say that, maybe just to add that, from our perspective, the natural environment of the island is not at all, it is full of human intervention. It's full of built architectures, whether it's, for example, this giant bird of paradise or this couch. They're interconnected and they're part of the same construction. And we were really interested in unpacking this colonial history and also complicating the reading of this history, where we often see it quite celebrated. It's worth looking at it in a more in a view that complicates it and that connects to other histories that are going on and the harm that was happening at the same time and continues to have such an impact here. So yeah,
in many ways it's not about the plants of Kawa Island at all, but they're just a conduit or a placeholder to think about other issues or stories. So we'll just play a really short excerpt. So you have to use your imagination quite a lot in viewing it that way. It's obviously meant for a 4-channel enveloping AV experience. It's not ideal to watch it on YouTube, but we were really pleased with how that came out, and we look forward to perhaps representing that work in a different context or a different format.
Yeah, and that brought us straight into our next project. In researching Cowo Island and Sir George Grey, we realized or learned more about his role in introducing pine to New Zealand. Pine and commercial forestry in New Zealand is very fraught. Pinus Radiata itself, the particular species, it's villainized. It's one of the species identified as a wilding pine, and so a tree that has naturalized in the environment here, and because it likes open plains and fields to germinate and grow, it's affecting what's known as tussock land, or sort of grasslands and mountainous areas of Aotearoa that are cherished and important sites.
I mean, it's just such a, we don't have time to explain all the ways that pine is like complicated and villainized here, and it's really hard to articulate to perhaps a North American centric audience because it is so different. But suffice to say, like the American chestnut tree, Pinus Radiata here is very, very loaded, and we wanted to work with that as our subject matter. So we worked with the commercial forestry operator here in Otipoti, Dunedin, and we were able to locate one individual old growth, well, relatively old pine tree, and we were able to go and meet that tree in its forest environment immediately before it was felled. And then it was felled, and we recorded biodata throughout this process, which ultimately never featured in the exhibition, and it was sort of a way of I don't know, making a work that was in parallel to the other pieces that we've shared with you all. So this tree was felled and gifted to us so that we could turn it into a sculpture. There it is. It's bigger than it looks in this photo. So this 6.2 meter cut section of pine is what we ultimately presented in a gallery space. It's about 4 tons. And it's massive, and it was really interesting sort of logistically to work on a project where we weren't able to really handle the material of our sculpture up until the last moment, where all the heavy machinery had helped us to handle it first. So we were gifted this tree, and we worked with a local small-scale lumber mill to cut it down into sections. These are effectively 8x2 timber lengths. As they were coming off the mill, we coated them very carefully. And then in the gallery space, we reassembled them in an approximation of the original log. So halfway between tree and timber. And I guess we were motivated to just step into this supply chain that's ordinarily, again, behind closed doors, and we don't have a relationship to that tree or that tree in process. We only really experience it as lumber or as a built house, or so here it is at the Blue Oyster Art Project Space in Otipoti, Dunedin. And this is very recent. This was only, this exhibition only concluded about 2 weeks ago. So this is our most recent work. And it's a work that we're really proud of. And we're really excited to work in this format of large scale installation and sculpture. A real challenge, a real backbreaking artwork, but a really satisfying artwork, and really well received by the community. Really had a sort of layer of experience that was olfactory, and the room was filled with this really intense smell, obviously, as the sap and moisture evaporated out of the tree and filled the space. And
intense moisture too. The window was wet every day.
That's right.
Yeah. In thinking about that piece, obviously we are thinking about locating ourselves within relationship to the plants that are around us and plants that we use. And we saw a connection to some of our older work in looking at plants that surround us in our day-to-day. And so as an accompanying piece, we also walked in a circle around the gallery neighborhood. Here's a map of sort of where we went, and we located plants that are epiphyte growing on the side of buildings, plants that have been intentionally planted, plants that are growing out of cracks, and all different varieties, trees, small annuals. Anyway, so we walked around the perimeter of the neighborhood, recording biodata from these plants, and developed an audio installation in the back section of the gallery that was just sound. The speakers are embedded in the walls, and so the sound surrounds you as you walk into the room. The speakers are placed in relationship to where the plants are outside. So when you're standing at one speaker, if you imagine drawing a line outside of the gallery into the neighborhood and into the distance, you would intersect with that plant. And so this was another way of us locating plants, locating ourselves in relationship to plants and bringing them into the gallery. The sound from this piece also spilled into the other room with the pine sculpture, and they were in communication.
And as these were effectively 10 separate channels, and the audio track from each channel was a separate length, they were never in sync with each other. It was a really organic and evolving audio piece. Every audience member effectively had a different experience with the work because it sounded different constantly. I think we should probably skip that excerpt though. We've been talking a long time.
Okay, yeah.
And yeah, so that's kind of where we're up to. And our next project is going to be at Te Tuhi, which is an art project space in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. And this is going to be the location for our work. There's this covered entranceway as you enter Te Tuhi, and it's flanked by some amazing mature exotic and native trees. And so we've recorded biodata from those trees, and there are speakers installed under that covered walkway. So they'll be sort of welcoming and introducing visitors. The biodata that we generate will be welcoming and introducing visitors to the exhibition space and later this year. So that concludes our talk. Thank you very much.
If anyone has questions, I've marked it so that you can unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat. I have questions.
I do see that there is one question in the chat asking if all of our documentation was completed in New Zealand. Everything from after leaving Vermont, everything that we shared in our talk after leaving our residency at Vermont Studio Center was all completed in New Zealand, because we've been here ever since. Yeah. So that's the answer to that question.
I find your work to be so incredibly thoughtful. I guess it's more of a question. I guess it's I really like this idea of, almost like asking the work, what am I not seeing, maybe, or what's not obvious. I had made some work at one point that I was recording people's conversations, but then I made an audio clip based on everything in between the words. And it kind of reminds me of that, although much more thoughtful. So it is, but then it complicates itself because you're trying to make sense of what's in between, what was, I guess, so out of all the projects you've shown us here, what was what did you have the most fun with discovering nuances or the in-betweens or what you didn't know before?
Radiata.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Radiata, the last exhibition that we shared of the cut pine section presented as a large-scale sculpture. I mean, I love the way that you articulated that. It really was about all the bits in between. And I think the temptation to like try and, or a sense of responsibility or duty to like make a thing with your material as an artist is very real. And it was really difficult to just leave it alone to the extent that we did. And like, we took a long time to decide on what we would present for that exhibition. And ultimately it was just like presenting the raw material itself was, I don't know, the way to get the most out of the intention.
Yeah. And that work also relied on a lot of working with a lot of other people who have expertise, machinery, and just abilities that we don't have. So of course there was the forestry company that gave us the tree. Well, we don't have a tree like that. So we couldn't have done that without them. And there were a lot of assumptions, I think, that we had going into that of what conversations we would have, what would come up through the project, that were completely wrong. Like that was one of the most fun things for me. It was just realizing that if given the opportunity to talk about something, even when it's like, even from within a forestry lens, you can have a lot of questions about what the future looks like, what role you play, what your work means. And it's so multidimensional. It challenged a lot of assumptions that one might have about that industry. And also like working with the person who milled the log for us was just such a surprise, his support for the project and some of the thoughts and ideas that we were putting into it. Yeah, so that was the most fun for me. Challenging my own assumptions, like from an artist's perspective, I guess. That yeah.
That's great. I love that. There are going to be a million questions when we're done.
That's all right.
Well, we wanted to also let you know that it looked like in Red Hook, that field that was fenced off had a goalpost, which would be football.
Yeah, I realized later. I mean, honestly, that's how
American
much
football. So you called it soccer, which, I mean.
Yeah, but I'm Canadian. Like I should know what that is, but that just gives you some context of my involvement with sports. So.
No, I think it's great though, because I think it also highlighted the curiosity that you have going into your work. Like it really wasn't important what that field was. That wasn't the association you were trying to pull from it. You were really curious about what was happening in that space. And I think that shows even in that small gesture,
I think the language is fascinating too, because football means something different here to what it means to Canada, to what it means to the United States.
Totally. Right.
We experienced a similar thing with our Radiata project where we didn't know what to, like in the context of forestry, the semantics is so interesting, like whether or not you call it a forest or a woodlot or a tree or a boar. There's all sorts of language around like whether or not it's like destined to be a product or a tree for a tree's sake or so on. And like I think playing with that language is something that really interests our work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Language is so clunky in that magical way. Yeah.
I love that work of yours. I saw an excerpt or documentation of it, the spaces in between the speech.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you did see it or you heard it? I mean, it was older stuff, but yeah, it's been around. But yeah, it was really fun to make. I actually got kind of really into everything in between, Like it really is the stuff you dismiss.
Mhm.
And the stuff you dismiss, there's so much information there.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I also want to say thank you for doing this and for being a part of a number of exhibitions now at VSC. You know, eventually, hopefully, there will be a permanent piece on the campus, the American Chestnut. What's it specifically called? Transgenic blight resistant American Chestnut. And then you were in the video show that we did right when the pandemic hit, and that was the first video show ever at VSC. I'm hoping there's more. And then this Pride exhibition, and then to have you here as guests. I'm just thrilled that you're here. So thanks for putting up with Zoom.
Well, thank you for having us. Vermont will always hold a special place in our hearts. I think it was a really, I don't know, we just like often, it feels like a dream, you know, the time that we spent there, it was so special and so formative for our work together. And we're just very grateful. And to have had that experience right before
Right. Yeah.
shit hit the fan, it
really was.
we feel very lucky.
2019, I'm like, oh, you're right. It was right before that.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ka kite.
Good night. I mean, good day.